It begins before there were calendars or nation-states or even writing, with people whose names are lost because names are a luxury of record-keeping. The first actors in this account are hominins who shaped stones, kept fires, and moved with the seasons in landscapes that shifted as glaciers advanced and retreated. More than 2 million years ago, tool-using ancestors in Africa flaked pebbles into sharp edges. Much later, in a span closer to our reach but still unimaginably distant, a particular branch of this lineage, anatomically modern, humans emerged in Africa around 200,000 years ago, carried knowledge in memory rather than on paper, and began to range outward. By roughly 70 to 50,000 years ago, groups left Africa in pulses that modern genetics still records in the code of living people. They followed coasts and rivers through the Arabian Peninsula into Eurasia, across southern Asia, into Australia by at least 65,000 years ago, and northward into colder Eurasian latitudes they mastered only after clothing, shelters, and organized hunting improved. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 26 to 19,000 years ago, land and sea rearranged themselves enough that a broad, cold grassland connected Siberia and Alaska. Across that corridor barren small bands of people moved in late Pleistocene time. They did not aim at continents. They aimed at water, wood, game, and stone, and step by step they found them. When climates warmed and ice sheets thinned, passages opened into the heart of the Americas. The archaeological record shows people south of the Great Ice by at least 14,500 years ago at Monte Verde in Chile. Other sites across North America and the interior West show that before the famous fluted spear points later called Clovis appeared about 13,200 years ago. Human camps and butchery already marked riverbanks and hillsides. In what is now the United States, evidence accumulates in places like the Buttermilk Creek Complex in Texas for early work with stone long before agriculture. The large mammals of the end of the ice, agamammoths, mastodons, giant ground sloths declined as climates shifted and as hunting pressure increased. The proportion of cause is debated, but the result is clear in bone beds that thin out over a few millennia. In Eurasia and Africa, meanwhile, people adapted to cold and mild climates alike. There were Neanderthals with strong arms and heavy brow ridges in Europe and Western Asia, and Denisovans in Asia, whose traces now survive in DNA among some modern populations. For tens of thousands of years, the economy was hunting and gathering, calibrated to wild herds and plant seasons. People made microliths and bone needles, decorated cave walls in places like Chauvet and Lascaux, and left fingerprints in clay and ochre. Nothing is yet written, but nothing is empty. The world is crisscrossed with routes of exchange for obsidian, shells, and ideas about rituals and tools. Then, unevenly and repeatedly, came the long shift to agriculture. It did not begin everywhere or all at once. In the Levant, a culture that archaeologists call Natchvian harvested wild cereals with flint sickles before anyone planted fields. By around 12 to 10,000 years ago, in the hills and valley edges of the Fertile Crescent, people began to select and sow forms of wheat and barley that dropped fewer seeds before harvest. While they enclosed herds of sheep and goats, they built walls of stone at places like Jericho, whose earliest layers are older than the mythic walls described in later texts. In Anatolia at Adelhek, by the 7th millennium BCE, mud brick houses pressed wall to wall, and people climbed onto roofs to move between rooms, entering dwellings through skylights and sleeping among plastered walls with images of horns and leopards. In the Indus borderlands, at Mergar, communities experimented with barley and zebu cattle early, while farther east, the Yellow River and Yangtze terraces in China saw the domestication of millet and rice respectively, with villages like Jiahu producing fermented beverages and bone flutes. By the 7th millennium BCE, New Guinea developed cultivation of taro and banana. In West Africa, pearl millet and sorghum became staples. In the Sal, pottery predates agriculture by thousands of years. A reminder that technologies do not arrive in fixed packages. In the Americas, teasant slowly transformed under human selection into maize, beans and squash joined the staple trio, and people in the Andes managed potatoes and camelids. Agriculture meant stored surplus where climate and soil cooperated, and where surplus existed, larger and more stable populations could build steady reputations, obligations, and institutions. The costs were immediate as well. Sedentary life encouraged parasites and pathogens. Garbage accumulated, monotony of diet concentrated deficiencies. Fields demanded predictable rains and soils that did not exhaust themselves. People with fields and herds had to defend them, and defense produced fences, ditches, and the normalization of fighting with neighbors for boundaries and rights to water. What we call civilization cities, writing, formal law, organized religion with large temples, kings who are more than temporary war, leaders grew out of this base in several locations and in different flavors, along the lower Tigris and Euphrates. The mud of southern Mesopotamia, cut by canals, bore fig trees and reeds and cereal crops, and supported repeated experiments in scale. During the Uruk period, in the 4th millennium BCE, the settlement that gives the period its name swelled beyond any contemporary. People there began to impress signs into clay with a stylus, a script we call cuneiform, initially to count and track deliveries of grain, textiles, and labor. The cylinder seal and the count tablet are as foundational to Mesopotamian civilization as any myth. There were temples with staffs and storehouses, and there were boundaries negotiated and violated by neighbors. Out of this fertile but contested zone, rulers emerged to stitch together territories too large to manage with a single set of hands. Sargon of Akkad, around 2330 for 2279 BC by conventional chronology, assembled an empire that held together multiple city-states from the Persian Gulf toward the northern plains. He claimed conquest, instituted a new system for governing with appointed officials, and needed to invent the logistics of rule, regular tribute, a courier system, and standardized practices across diverse communities. A few centuries later, under the Third Dynasty of Ur, kings extended a more bureaucratic approach, tracking rations and work rotations day by day in a flood of clay records that modern editors still piece together. Then came Amorite rulers, like Hammurabi of Babylon in the 18th century BCE, whose famous stela is a rhetorical artifact as much as a legal one, a program that publicizes the king's role in justice and channels customary practice into a royal narrative. The laws are specific, varied, and tied to social rank, and they presume a commercial city crowded with disputes about debt, injury, paternity, and property lines. Egypt along the Nile followed its own template, the river's periodic rise and fall, with a flood that usually obeyed a calendar, created a long green corridor through desert that functioned almost like a single, elongated town with a common script and rituals that made sense of the sun cycle. A unification tradition places a king named Narmer or Menes at the start of dynastic rule, around 3100 BCE. Within centuries, kings raised stone in cubes large enough to humble millennia of visitors. The step pyramid at Saqqara under Djoser in the 3rd dynasty 27th century BCE. Then the geometric audacity of the 4th dynasty pyramids on the Giza Plateau during the 26th century BCE. Those monuments were not built by mythical slave legions. They were products of organized labor, seasonal work crews fed and housed by a state that could mobilize the countryside when the rivers flood idled farmers. The Old Kingdom's ideology bound earth and sky, kin and gods. In a rigid form, its collapse brought local rulers and experiments in power. During the First Intermediate Period, the Middle Kingdom restored centrality, extended irrigation, and sent expeditions south and east. The Second Intermediate Period saw the entry of Hyksos rulers, who brought new military techniques including horse-drawn chariots. The New Kingdom, beginning around 1550 BCE, projected Egyptian power outward, and the rulers, like Thutmose II and Ramses II, fought at Kadesh with Hittites for control of the Levant, carved mortuary temples at Thebes, and filled tombs in the Valley of the Kings with objects for an eternal journey. Throughout, scribes kept records on papyrus, and artisans perfected a style that still makes the figures on a museum wall immediately recognizable. To the east, the Indus or Harappan civilization built cities in brick on a plan that impresses modern planners: straight streets in a grid, standardized baked bricks, drainage systems that carried waste from household to channel, and granaries whose function still sparks debate. At Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, the mature Harappan period, from roughly 2600 to 1900 BC, produced seus with animal motifs and an undeciphered script, weights and measures of startling consistency, and neighborhoods that suggest both planning and local flexibility. There is no obvious single palace, no giant temples in the Mesopotamian sense, and if there were kings, they left little claim on stone. The civilization declined gradually, with shifts in river courses like the drying Saraswati divided by Gagar-Hakra system, and stresses from climate fluctuations around the so-called 4-to-kill-a-year event, when drying in many regions restructured economies and migration patterns. People did not vanish, they changed habits, as we can all see in the continuous traditions of craft and settlement across northwestern South Asia. After 1900 BCE, farther north, in the steppe zones between forests and mountains, people adapted a different solution to aridity and distance: mobility on horseback. Early domestication of horses occurred on the Eurasian steppe by the 4th millennium BCE, with the Batai culture in Kazakhstan keeping herds and likely milking them. Later, around the early 2nd millennium BCE, cultures like Sintashta in the Ural region built fortified settlements and forged sophisticated bronze weapons, while evidence of spoked wheel chariots, fast, fragile, and effective, appears with burials that pair humans, horses, and vehicles. The technology spread across Eurasia. It reached the Near East, where elite warriors drove chariots in small teams across plains and left reliefs and texts boasting of mobility and shock. China's earliest urban and state formations took a distinct course. Archaeological sites such as Early Tou on the Yellow River Plain, roughly 1900–1500 BCE, show large palatial platforms and bronze industry that some associate with the legendary Xia, the first clearly documented dynasty. The Shum, from around 1600 to 1046 BCE, left oracle bones, scapulae and turtle plastrons inscribed with questions to ancestral powers about weather, harvests, and war, and then cracked in fire to read the answers. Shang elites controlled bronze foundries capable of casting heavy ritual vessels in complex molds, and they sacrificed animals and people in ceremonies that knitted together cosmology and rule. After the Zhou conquered the Shan, around 1046 BCE, they articulated the mandate of heaven, a principle that explained rule as a moral charge that could be revoked by natural disaster and popular suffering, setting a political rhythm that would echo across centuries. West of China, across the Iranian plateau, Elam linked Mesopotamia and the highlands, while to the north and west the Hittite kingdom in Anatolia mastered ironworking traditions and fought with Egypt for Levantine cities. The Mitanni and later Assyrians contested the same zone, and the Canaanite cities along the coast built long-distance trade into an art. The people we call Phoenicians traveled and traded timber, purple dye, and knowledge of shipcraft. They planted colonies like Carthage on the North African shore in the 1st millennium BCE, setting seeds that would grow into serious competitors in the Western Mediterranean. In Europe beyond the Mediterranean, the Neolithic had brought farming, and megaliths lifted slowly onto hills by communities that planned with rope and muscle. Stonehenge was a late chapter in a long tradition of building with very heavy stones in alignment with the sky. But the deeper story is the spread of agriculture from Anatolia into the Balkans and across the continent between 7000 and 4000 BCE, followed by the intermingling of these farmers with incoming steppe populations in the 3rd millennium BCE, a blending event now visible in genetic studies as a major component of many later European populations. Metallurgy in copper and bronze followed trade networks for tin and copper that can be traced by isotopes in artifacts. Amber from the Baltic moved south, and finished goods moved north. Technological progress never ran in a straight line. It advanced with exchanges, setbacks, and local reinventions. Africa being the Nile carried thick histories, not always visible in older textbooks. The Sahara itself was greener during parts of the early Holocene, when monsoon patterns pushed rains north and paralists moved with cattle into zones that are desert today, leaving rock art of swimmer and herds along now dry riverbeds. As the Sahara dried in the late Holocene, people migrated toward the Sahel and along the Nile corridor. In West Africa, the Nok culture in present-day Nigeria produced terracotta figures from about 1000 BC and early ironwork, while farther east, the kingdom of Kush and Napata and later Meroe ruled portions of the Nile Valley and developed scripts and industries that linked them to and distinguished them from Egypt. The Bantu-speaking expansions, beginning around the late 2nd millennium BC and extending well into the 1st millennium CE, spread agriculture, ironworking, and languages through much of sub-Saharan Africa, changing demography and ecology in ways still legible on a linguistic map. In South Asia, after the decline of the urban Indus pattern, Indo-Aryan language groups entered the subcontinent from the northwest during the 2nd millennium BCE, mingling with existing populations. A corpus of hymns later collected as the Rig Veda preserves echoes of pastoral communities, ritual practices, and a pantheon of deities who favored the sky, storms, and fire. Iron tools became common in the 1st millennium BCE, clearing forests and opening the Gangetic Plain to new agrarian states. Urbanization returned in the middle of that millennium with cities like Pataliputra. Councils and kingdoms argued over law and metaphysics, and teachers like the Buddha and Mahavira redefined what counted as a life well lived. Those pieces feed later, but the groundwork, land, tools, population density, institutions was being laid. Across the Pacific, the Austronesian-speaking world took shape on the water, originating around Taiwan and the northern Philippines several thousand years ago. Seafaring communities in outrigger canoes fanned out across island Southeast Asia, carrying starchy crops, pigs, and pottery. By around 1500 BCE, the Lapita people had reached the western Pacific Islands with a distinctive Dantata stamped pottery style, and in the following centuries, their descendants pushed into the empty Central Pacific in one of humanity's great expansions, navigating by stars, swells, and intuition honed by apprenticeship. Polynesia's triangulated world Hawaii to the north, Aotearoa divided by New Zealand to the southwest, Rapa Nui divided by Easter Island to the southeast would not be fully settled until the 1st millennium CE, but the techniques and social structures that made that settlement possible were forming in the late Bronze Age of the Old World. In the Americas, after the initial peopling and the post-glacial transformations of landscapes and fauna, regional cultures diversified. In what is now Mexico, people domesticated maize, squash, and beans to a degree that allowed dense populations. The Olmec along the Gulf Coast, flourishing roughly 1200–400 BCE, carved colossal heads and assembled ceremonial centers at San Lorenzo and La Venta, suggesting hierarchy, labor organization, and an iconography that later Mesoamerican civilizations would rework. In the southwestern United States, archaic foragers experimented with cultivation, with maize agriculture taking root more widely by the 1st millennium BCE. Over time, distinctive cultural complexes ancestral Pueblo in the Four Corners, Hohokam in the Sonoran Desert, Mogollon in the mountains Butte irrigation, Pueblos, and trade networks in the eastern woodlands of North America. The Poverty Point culture constructed large earthworks by around 1700–1100 BC in present-day Louisiana, a geometry in Solane scale, rivaling Old World projects in ambition if not in stone. In the Ohio Valley, Adana and later Hopewell traditions raised mounds, built effigy earthworks, and exchanged copper, mica, and exotic stones over long distances. None of these peoples wrote with alphabetic scripts we have recovered from that time, but their geometry and artifact distributions record substantial planning and communication. While agriculture and cities and writing remade many societies, the Bronze Age also built the tools for catastrophe. Around 1200 BCE, in the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, a cluster of crises often called the Bronze Age collapses scrambled the political map. Climate stress may have contributed. Tree rings and sediment cores suggest drought in some zones. Trade networks that supplied tin to copper smelting centers were fragile. Disrupt them, and tools and weapons became harder to replace. Sea peoples, an umbrella term modern historians use for maritime raiders, and migrants recorded by Egyptian inscriptions attacked coastal cities. Within a century or two, palace economies in Mycenaean Greece, the Hittite realm in Anatolia, and cities along the Levant fell or contracted severely. Linear rewriting in Greece vanished with the palaces that needed it. Egyptian power pulled inward after repelling raids. Out of this destruction, new forms appeared. Small iron tools replaced bronze where iron ore was available, but the knowledge to smelt and forge it had spread. New polities formed that would, in the coming centuries, set the stage for classical eras in multiple regions. From the ashes of the Hittite collapse, small kingdoms like Phrygia and Lydia organized in Anatolia. Along the Levantine coast, Phoenician city-states rebuilt and later launched more colonies. Inland, the highlanders of the central Levant formed Israel and Judah, remembered in biblical texts shaped over centuries but grounded in a political reality of vassalage, revolt, and survival among stronger neighbors. In Mesopotamia, Assyria hardened itself into a machine for expansion, fielding disciplined armies that used iron weapons, siege techniques, and deportations to manage an empire that at its peak in the 7th century BC stretched from Egypt's borderlands to the Persian plateau. The Syrian system was brutal and effective until it became a target too large to defend from multiple sides. In 612 BCE, a coalition of Medes and Babylonians sacked Nineveh. The Neo-Babylonian kingdom that followed, with Nebuchadnezzar I as a marquis ruler, rebuilt monumental Babylon and took Jerusalem into captivity. While farther east, Cyrus the Great forged the Persian Empire by unifying Iranian tribes and conquering Lydia, Babylon, and Vienna, establishing a model of rule that allowed cultural diversity under a standardized administrative framework. The Persians built the royal road, minted coins, and governed satrapies under an imperial ideology that advertised benevolent order. Greek city-states would later test themselves against this power and then imitate parts of it when opportunity allowed. In the Aegean, after the Greek dark centuries that followed the Mycenaean collapse, small communities organized themselves into polis city-states with citizens who, in a few places, could speak in assemblies and hold office in turns. The details varied. Sparta organized its society around military discipline and an underclass of helots. Athens experimented with broader participation and the use of juries and councils to make law. The Greeks borrowed letters from Phoenician traders and made an alphabet with vowels, a convenience that helped preserve epics and laws in place. Philosophers and dramatists and sculptors flourished in a few crowded decades of the 5th century BCE. While at the same time, the city fought and taxed and turned alliances into empires that allies resented. When the Persian kings attempted to subdue the fractious Greeks, they met luck against odds at Marathon and cunning at Salamis, and later the Greeks were down one another in a long war that left them open to a new kind of unifier from the north. By then, in the central Mediterranean, other experiments matured. The Etruscans ruled city-states in Italy with a taste for divination and engineering. Latin-speaking communities around the Tiber built alliances and an early republic that set out offices with terms, checks, and norms. Across the sea, Carthage perfected commerce and naval power. All those stories belong to a later segment. The pattern, however, is set in the accumulation of the centuries we have surveyed. Agriculture makes surplus, surplus makes cities, cities make storage, counting, and writing. Writing makes states that last longer than any individual and can plan projects across a generation. And the whole edifice rides on trade routes, climate stability, and the willingness of neighbors to stay neighbors. When those conditions wobble, the system shakes, but people rebuild with the pieces at hand. Across the Atlantic, the long arc of North American prehistory continued to add its own building blocks for future complexity. While Egypt raised obelisks, populations in the eastern woodlands calculated earthen circles with cardinal alignments and maintained networks that carried marine shell up the Mississippi, as later Mississippian towns would carry their iconography downriver centuries ahead. In the desert Southwest, canals pushed river water across low slopes to support fields that could sustain plaza communities. These North American systems did not rely on draft animals or wheeled transport in the pre-Columbian era, and their toolkits were adjusted accordingly: baskets, digging sticks, manos and metates for grinding maize, and architecture adapted to climate, from pit houses to cliff dwellings. The differences from Afro-Eurasian trajectories make sense in their ecosystems and histories, and the similarities: planning, storage, ritual calendars tied to the sky are just as instructive. By the end of the first millennium BCE, the world was more tightly connected than it had been 1,000 years earlier, but it was still a patchwork of regional systems. The relative isolation of the Americas and Oceania kept their histories mostly parallel to Eurasian and African developments. In Afro-Eurasia, caravans crossed Central Asian corridors between oasis towns. Ships hubbed coasts between Mediterranean ports. The Nile barge drifted past reeds and villages, and on foot and hoof messengers carried news to courts where scribes turned words into marks that could outlast breath. The cumulative effect of those marks is the reason this narrative can continue with any confidence.